Chapter 5. The Lunar Era. The Shamanic Vision. Kinship with all creation. I am the brother of the forest, and must defend it. David Kopanawa Yanomami, a contemporary Amazon shaman. Who, in our allegedly progressive civilization, is capable of understanding the language of rocks and trees? Jean Cheran, physicist. It is a considerable challenge for the modern rational mind to enter into the very different consciousness of the lunar era, where people lived in small communities which remained in close relationship with the same area of land for many thousands of years. With the movement of increasing numbers of people to cities, where we have become cut off from any physical contact with the land, we have become alienated from the soul of the landscape, the soul of nature. We live in a secular culture, and no longer have a myth to connect us with the living cosmos. We no longer regard the earth as our mother. As Mircea Eliade observed, desacralization pervades the entire experience of the non-religious man of modern societies. This makes it difficult for us to enter into the soul of archaic man in shamanic societies and respond to his fundamental understanding that the life of the cosmos, the life of the earth, and the life of humanity were one life, permeated and informed by animating spirit. For many thousands of years, before the advent of religion as we know it, and even to this day, people in shamanic cultures aligned themselves and their communities with an unseen dimension of reality. Their lives had meaning and value because they felt they lived within a sacred cosmic order, where spirit, though invisible, was not regarded as something remote from nature. Nature was ensouled with spirit. With the rise of the patriarchal religions, this sense of containment within a sacred order began to fade, although in Europe it survived to some extent until the end of the Middle Ages. I believe this loss had its distant roots in an image of God, who was defined as a creator, separate and distinct from his creation, who did not hold the world within his being, nor was present in every leaf, every creature in this world. It also had its roots in the myth of the fall of man, see chapter 7, which tells the story of how, as a punishment for disobeying the will of God, we were expelled from the divine world and exiled to this world of suffering, sin, and death. Western civilization was profoundly influenced by these beliefs and developed on the foundation of a fundamental dualism, a split between spirit and nature, creator and creation. This split ultimately destroyed the ancient shamanic experience of an ensouled nature and opened the way to its ultimate exploitation. It led to our current worldview, which rests on the premise of our separation from and mastery of nature, where nature is subject to the will and the perceived needs of our species. Yet we carry within our psyche the inheritance of two different kinds of consciousness, two different ways of knowing. Firstly, a participatory lunar way of knowing described in the last chapter, and in this one that was mediated through instinctive feeling, acute powers of analogical thinking, a highly developed intuition, and shamanic techniques of connection with an unseen dimension of reality. This dimension was never seen as separate from nature, but rather was the invisible ground of nature, variously called the spirit world, the other world, and sometimes by the later Greeks, the immortal realm. Secondly, a more recent solar way of knowing developed through the spread of literature, whose focus was on the development of the intellect or rational mind, eventually leading to our present scientific and technologically oriented culture, where there is a fundamental disjunction between our human selves and the world of nature. Over the course of thousands of years, the second way of knowing replaced the first, although for many centuries and in different regions of the earth they overlapped. To understand the primary needs of our own time, we need to know something of these two great meta-narratives, these two different kinds of consciousness, and the circumstances which led to one overlaying, replacing, or displacing the other. It may help to view them as representative of different phases in the evolution of consciousness. The main feature of the shamanic way of knowing that the English philosopher Owen Barfield called original participation in his book Saving the Appearances, A Study in Idolatry, was an instinctive feeling of relationship with a living earth and cosmos, and a sense of kinship with all creation. No one has described this state of consciousness better than Richard Tarnas in his book Cosmos and Psyche. The primal human being perceives the surrounding natural world as permeated with meaning, meaning whose significance is at once human and cosmic. Spirits are seen in the forest. Presences are felt in the wind and the ocean, the river, the mountain. The primal world is ensouled. It is pregnant with signs and symbols, implications and intentions. A continuity extends from the interior world of the human to the world outside. The human being is a microcosm within the macrocosm of the world, participating in its interior reality and united with the whole in ways that are both tangible and invisible. The human psyche is embedded within a world psyche. Within this relatively undifferentiated state of consciousness, human beings perceive themselves as directly, emotionally, mystically, consequentially, participating in and communicating with the interior life of the natural world and cosmos. To be more precise, this participation mystique involves a complex sense of direct inner participation, not only of human beings in the world, but also of human beings in the divine powers through ritual, and divine powers in the world by virtue of their immanent and transformative presence. This primordial participatory consciousness has survived today in indigenous cultures, such as those of the Kogi Indians of Colombia, the Mayans, the North American and Amazonian Indians, the people of Outer Mongolia, certain communities in Africa, and the Aboriginal peoples of Australia and New Zealand. All of these were, and still are, shamanic cultures. But it also existed in highly sophisticated ancient civilizations, such as those of Egypt, India, and China, and is discovered in the Corpus Hermeticum of Egypt, in the sublime texts of the Vedas and Upanishads of India, in the Taoist texts of China, and in the mystical tradition of Kabbalah, described in Chapter 3. In all these traditions there is no dualism. Nature is not split off from spirit. The two were regarded in essence as one. The phenomenal world was the manifest form and dwelling place of invisible spirit. As the Bhagavad Gita proclaims, all is divine being. The most important insight of these shamanic cultures was that spirit is ubiquitous, present within every aspect of the phenomenal world, and that man does not hold a position of dominance in relation to nature. Shamanic cultures lived within a sacred order. We do not recognize the existence of such an order, and that is why the collective soul of humanity has become disconnected from its roots, and why our culture has become dysfunctional and is unable to respond to our deepest needs. Why does this matter? Because if we don't know the ancient mythological influences that have formed our way of thinking, We cannot develop the insight we need to change our beliefs and modify our behavior, nor can we reconnect with a living, yet silenced aspect of our psyche that has for too long been denied access to our conscious mind. We cannot become whole. Because our highly developed science and technology have vastly improved the material conditions of our lives, we have come to view the history of civilization as an ascent from darkness, superstition, and ignorance, an ascent to a sunlit upland from a primitive and thankfully outgrown past. This position is no longer tenable in the light of archaeological and anthropological discoveries, and the large amount of data that has now been gathered over the past century about shamanic cultures, past and present, in different parts of the world. Moreover, as Richard Rugeley writes in his comprehensive study of prehistoric culture, Lost Civilizations of the Stone Age, in the light of the vast body of evidence collected in this book, it is now clear that a fundamental assessment of the prehistoric contribution to civilization is necessary. Each of the elements of civilization has been shown to have been highly developed before the rise of ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia. Civilization did not suddenly appear around 5,000 years ago. We may look back on this remote past with some arrogance, congratulating ourselves on having long outgrown its magical approach to life. We do not realize that our present consciousness has evolved out of the matrix of this ancient and instinctive way of knowing, characterized by an awareness of the relationship between all orders of reality, seen and unseen. But with considerable conscious effort, we can recover and integrate this older way of knowing with our rational mind and our current view of reality. Sacred geography and a living cosmos. To live within a sacred order was to experience the whole universe as a living being, to know that cosmic and earthly life were intimately connected, and to study not only every aspect of the immediate environment, but the position and course of the moon, the major stars, and the constellations, in order to harmonize the life of the community with the life and rhythms of the cosmos. Everything, plants, trees, animals, and birds, as well as moon, sun, and stars, were sacred, sentient and alive, infused with divinity, because each and all were part of a living, breathing, connecting web of life. This instinctive awareness of the unity and sacredness of life has lived in the depths of the human psyche for infinitely longer than the religions and the science of our time, which do not recognize nature as sacred or matter as alive. In shamanic cultures, the landscape itself was experienced as living and sacred, because certain places or features of it were seen as portals to an invisible world, peopled by the unseen powers of nature, by the spirits of animals, and by the ancestors. A special feature in the land was held to be sacred because it marked the place of connection between the visible and invisible dimensions. Paul Devereux, in his comprehensive study of shamanic societies and customs, Sacred Geography, Deciphering Hidden Codes in the Landscape, writes, "Sacred geography is where the physical world and the worlds of spirit and soul meet. Ancient communities invested their surroundings with meaning in many ways, by identifying natural landscape features as sacred, by embellishing natural places to become monuments and temples, or by inscribing vast areas with patterns, images, and otherworldly pathways, superimposing virtual geographies onto material topography. Other sacred geographies relied on scent, touch, or sound, echoes, whispering waters, and musical rocks signifying the presence of gods and spirits. Sacred geography mythologized a landscape and gave it meaning. This describes what was essentially a sensory participatory experience, deeply rooted in the life of nature. Certain places have remained sacred for thousands of years, and many are so to this day in China, Tibet, and India, Australia, and South America. In India alone, there are 150 major sites of pilgrimage that annually draw as many as 20 million pilgrims to places like Benares and the source of the Ganges. China is rediscovering its ancient sites of pilgrimage to its holy mountains. Mount Kailas in Tibet, held sacred by Hindus from time immemorial as the sacred mountain, believed to connect earth with heaven, still draws thousands of pilgrims, both Hindu and Buddhist, to make the arduous pilgrimage around its base. Millions of Muslims make a pilgrimage to Mecca and the Black Stone of the Kaaba, at least once in their lives, and in Europe thousands visit shrines such as Lourdes, where the Virgin Mary is said to have appeared, as well as the many shrines of the Black Madonna. In shamanic cultures, there was a specific place that was, like Mount Kailas, regarded as a world center, an axis mundi, associated in different areas of the world with the image of a spiral ladder or stairway, a braided sky rope or rainbow bridge, much like the entwined double serpent shape of the caduceus and the spiral form of DNA. This was a stargate or place which gave the shaman access to a cosmic path of connection with the spirit world. The three unified dimensions of sky, earth, and underworld, formerly the domains of the Great Mother, were connected by this central access. Today, Chartres Cathedral is the most sacred place in Europe, an axis mundi from long before the time that it was built, a gateway of connection to the invisible world. Jeremy Narby, in his book The Cosmic Serpent, explores in fascinating detail the ubiquity of this ancient cosmology of connection. Jacob's famous dream of a ladder stretching from earth to heaven with angels ascending and descending it is a shamanic vision of the mysterious double helix bridge connecting two worlds or dimensions of reality. In The Future of the Ancient World, Essays on the History of Consciousness, Jeremy Nadler writes that in many different shamanic cultures, we encounter again and again the idea that the pole star marks a tiny hole, a gap, window, or entrance that leads out of the physically perceptible world of space and time to the invisible spirit world. The actual place in the landscape of the earth which marked the axis mundi or portal of connection to the spirit world might be a cave, a holy mountain, or a mountain recreated in a stone temple like the ziggurats of Yucatan. It could also be the shape or color or placement of an unusual stone or the gushing source of a river like the Ganges, drawing millions of pilgrims for special rituals. Or it could be an impressive waterfall, a deep fissure or crevice in the rock, or a gnarled and venerable tree. Great rivers were seen as crossing places between this world and the spirit world. There were sacred ways or avenues that could be walked by devotees in ritual events, such as the great stone causeway of the Mayan culture and the Nazca lines in Peru. For the Kogi Indians of Colombia, these sacred paths were thought to be replicas of the sacred routes in the other world walked by the spirits. To this day, Kogi shamans, known as mamas, walk their sacred stone paths. Dreams, visions, and hallucinogenic drugs assisted the journey of shamans along these spirit world paths. Dreams and visions may have also revealed to them the placement and shape of their stone temples and designated a sacred place of connection between worlds. Today, we can recognize the beautiful and elaborate crop circles appearing in our fields of ripened wheat as places of connection between our world and the unseen world, whose existence is not recognized by our culture. The megalith builders. Some of the remarkable temples and stone circles built by people in the late Neolithic as places of connection with the spirit world still survive where their remains strewn all over Europe. Stonehenge, Avebury and Silbury Hill in southern England, Newgrange, Knowth and Carrowkeel in Ireland, Skara Brae in the Orkneys, Carnac in Brittany, the great megalithic temples on Malta and Gozo were some of the most sacred sites of that ancient time, whose structures and significance are still little understood. Through radiocarbon dating, many of these sacred sites, including the Maltese temples, are known to have been built before the pyramids of Giza. It is possible that the Maltese temples may have been part of the civilization of old Europe, described by the archaeologist Marija Gimbutas, which dated to at least 5000 BC. The earliest stone circle at Stonehenge dates to 3000 BC, and it is now thought to have been a lunar temple before it became a solar one. Around 2000 BC, it was a renowned center of healing, drawing people from faraway places, including the continent of Europe. It was also the place where, in a great annual ritual at the winter solstice, focused on the setting sun, people walked in procession along a great causeway to bring the ashes of their dead to this sacred place of connection with the spirit world, and ensure a safe passage into that world for the souls of the dead. At Newgrange, the rising sun on the 21st of December shines directly through an aperture above the entrance to the passage grave for 17 minutes. During this time, its rays travel down the shaft until they reach a stone at the end, engraved with a triple spiral, signifying perhaps the understanding that life is without end or beginning, an eternal process of regeneration, or possibly pointing to the three interconnected worlds of the Great Mother, sky, earth, and underworld. The narrow entrance to the inner chambers of the passage grave of Knowth, shaped like an inverted V, may have signified to the people of that time that it was the entrance to the womb of the Great Mother, to which all life returned, and from which it would be reborn. Silbury Hill, Europe's tallest prehistoric monument, stood near the center of an enormous sacred complex of standing stones that had the shape of a gigantic serpent carrying 2 eggs in its belly. This serpentine temple, drawn in 1740 by Sir Thomas Stukely, is now lost, save for a few massive stones around Avebury, and reveals the astonishing astronomical, mathematical, and engineering skills of these Stone Age builders. What is clear is that both astronomy and numerology were of great importance and significance to these master builders for aligning their buildings and the life of their communities with the cosmic order. The research of John Michel, described in his book City of Revelation, shows that ancient societies possessed a code of law, or sacred canon, imparted to them as revelation by the gods at the time of the founding of their societies. The essence of this sacred canon, or code of law, was a complete cosmology, which included the science of numbers and musical harmonies, and their relation to the cosmic order, and its hierarchy of creative forces. This canon and its sacred numbers was known to the builders of the temple at Stonehenge and incorporated into that and other temples of the megalithic era. For thousands of years, Michel says it was the perfect instrument of wise government and was known and practiced throughout the entire ancient world, including Egypt and Greece. What is mind-blowing is that the building of these gigantic stone temples and causeways would have required the cooperation of thousands of people engaged in a sacred communal task comparable to the building of Chartres Cathedral millennia later. Skilled architects, astronomers, and engineers designed and built these stone temples as places where people could assist in rituals that were believed to regenerate the fertility of the earth and maintain the relationship between the human community and the sacred order of the cosmos. Because they trusted absolutely that their loved ones would return to this world, there was possibly less fear of death than there is today. These rituals, presided over by astronomer priests and tied to the rhythm of the sun, moon, and certain of the major stars and planets, in particular Venus, must have been incredibly numinous to experience, particularly at sunrise and sunset, the rise of the full moon, and the time of an eclipse. The whole community participated in them. People who were constantly fighting with neighboring clans or tribes would never have been able to construct these monuments. The shaman. It seems necessary to define two kinds of shamanic experience. One is the ability to communicate with the spirit of rocks, trees, and plants, and to open a channel of connection with the spirit world through a specific feature or quality of the landscape, like the axis mundi mentioned above. The other is the ability to leave the physical body and travel into other dimensions in the spirit world. Certain techniques passed from shaman to shaman in different cultures, as well as the use of hallucinogenic drugs, facilitated both these experiences. Mircea Eliade described the second experience when he wrote the first authentic in-depth study of Central Asian and Siberian shamanism in 1964. He defined the shaman as a master of ecstasy and shamanism as a technique of ecstasy. It is impossible to imagine a period when man did not have dreams and waking reveries and did not enter into trance, a loss of consciousness that was interpreted as the soul's traveling into the beyond. Shamanic practices are known to have existed from the depths of time in many parts of the world. One dramatic scene in the original cave of Lascaux, whose paintings are now tragically affected by mould and may disappear forever, is painted on one wall of a deep shaft at the far end of the cave and is dated to about 14,500 BC. Not reproduced in the modern replica, it shows a dying bison transfixed by a spear, standing next to a shaman with a bird's head, who lies on the ground with his arms outstretched and his penis erect, as if in a trance. His staff is surmounted by a bird, suggesting that, like the shamans of Central Asia and Siberia, he is flying like the bird on his staff to the spirit world. Westerners now travel to the Amazonian forest to participate in shamanic practices, to penetrate the veil between the very limited consciousness of our culture and the extraordinary expansion of consciousness experienced by taking a hallucinogenic drug and entering a multidimensional world. This experience can be terrifying and may be dangerous for some people. In another part of the world, a couple recently took their disturbed child to be healed by the reindeer shamans of Outer Mongolia with spectacular results. See The Horseboy by Rupert Isaacson. The idea of an expanded state seems alien, even threatening to the consciousness we have today, yet it is important that we become aware of its existence, because it suggests that we may have lost a capacity that has atrophied through lack of use. A contemporary technique for entering these unfamiliar states of consciousness has been developed by the Czech psychiatrist Stanislav Grof, one of the pioneers who has extensively explored them. He has found that in altered states of consciousness, ancient fields of memory and ancient experiences from humanity's past, as well as the past experience of other species, can become accessible to our consciousness. Beneath or beyond the threshold of our conscious mind, an incredibly rich legacy from the past lives on and is still accessible. The essence of the shamanic experience. Over countless thousands of years, shamanic myths and rituals of connection kept alive the awareness of the existence of an invisible spirit world or soul world, whose symbol, initially, may have been the mysterious dark phase of the moon. Out of that darkness, the crescent was continually reborn, symbolically associated with the regeneration of the earth's life, and, in the traditions of Vedic India, with the regeneration of cosmic cycles, each lasting hundreds of thousands of years. Poets, artists, seers, and musicians received their inspiration and their calling from the starry cosmos that was as real to them as this world. Shamanic cultures knew there was no death. They were in touch with the ancestors. They knew about traveling to other worlds. Greece had the Eleusinian mysteries that gave people trust in their survival. Long before Greece, Bronze Age Egypt had a very detailed description of the journey of the soul after death. This extraordinary civilization was as aware of the spirit world as of this world. People lived in awareness of the presence of the spirit world and the goddesses and gods who inhabited the starry cosmos and descended each day into their temples. Far from seeing death as extinction, the Egyptians saw death as a journey towards awakening to cosmic life. People did not so much believe in gods and goddesses as encounter them, as vividly described in the Iliad and the Odyssey. They may have heard these beings speak and received wisdom and guidance from them, or seen them in their dreams, because the clear distinction we now make between an inner and outer world did not then exist, and because they felt they lived within a sacred order. The psyche of that time lived within that order, in communion with it. The words spoken, the music heard, the dreams and visions came not from inside them, but from the soul of the cosmos, from daemonic beings, goddesses and gods, and the spirits of animals, trees, mountains, and rivers, as well as from the ancestors who were never thought of as dead, but who formed a continuous line of connections with the living. Oracles could impart the will of these beings, and people knew that they were not alone in this world, but could be guided and influenced as well as threatened by unseen entities. Birds were recognized as messengers of this invisible world, very possibly because people dreamed about them in this role, or even heard them as a voice speaking to them. The earliest legends about the great oak tree at Dodona in northern Greece said that oracles were delivered by the oak itself, and that when birds happened to alight on the tree would suddenly begin speaking with a human voice. The oracle at Delphi was the center of the Greek world, where the celebrated priestess of the oracle, or Pythia, as she was called, received embassies from all over the Greek Empire. She held the title of the Delphic Bee, and was the highest authority in that world, intermediary between the supplicant and the god Apollo. A highly developed intuitive sensibility, acute powers of observation, and the ability to listen to the spirits of plants, trees, and animals taught people to gather, grind, or distill certain herbs and plants, or the bark of trees for healing illness. Dreams and visions were of great importance in the diagnosis and healing of disease. Methods of divination predicted the advisability of taking certain courses of action. From all over the Greek Empire, people travelled great distances to the many healing sanctuaries of the god Aesculapius, the most famous of which were of Epidaurus, Kos, and Pergamum in modern Turkey, to be healed of their diseases. Here, as also in Egypt and Crete, the main diagnostic agent was the dream, sometimes a visionary dream of the god himself, as one man who was healed of his long-standing illness described it in words that leap out vividly from a forgotten past. One listened and heard things, sometimes in a dream, sometimes in waking life. One's hair stood on end. One cried and felt happy. One's heart swelled out, but not with vainglory. What human being could put this experience into words? But anyone who has been through it will share my knowledge and recognize the state of my mind. Rites of incubation, traveling in the spirit world, and healing were practiced in caves and sacred places all over the ancient world. Like the astronomer priests of Egypt who communicated with the stars, or the Taoist sages of China and the Vedic seers of India, withdrawn into the deep solitude of the mountains and forests, the shaman seers who guided these cultures were trained to enter a state of utter stillness, to listen and bring back to their community what they heard in an enhanced state of consciousness. At the heightened level of awareness that characterized the participatory consciousness of these cultures, everything had the ability to communicate. A stone as much as a star, an animal as much as a tree, or a spring gushing out of a crevice in the rock. What we now call synchronicities were an intrinsic and recognized part of the experience of the people of that time, because they had the intuitive ability to notice things far more acutely than we do today. The unseen soul of nature had the potential to reveal itself in the flight of a bird, the stirring of the leaves of an oak tree, the ripples on a lake. Nature was held to be animate, conscious, and able to communicate with man. The essential characteristic of lunar culture was kinship, the kinship of man with all creation, reflected in the much-quoted words of Chief Seattle. Every part of this earth is sacred to my people. We are part of the earth, and it is part of us. The perfumed flowers are our sisters. The bear, the deer, the great eagle, these are our brothers. The shining water that moves in the dreams and rivers is not just water, but the blood of our ancestors. The water's murmur is the voice of my father's father. The rivers are our brothers. They quench our thirst. They carry our canoes and feed our children. Remember that the air is precious to us, that the air shares its spirit with all the life it supports. The wind that gave our grandfather his first breath also receives his last sigh. The wind also gives our children the spirit of life. Will you teach your children what we have taught our children, that the earth is our mother, that what befalls the earth befalls all the sons of the earth? This we know. The earth does not belong to man. Man belongs to the earth. All things are connected like the blood which unites us all. Man did not weave the web of life. He is merely a strand in it. Whatever he does to the web, he does to himself. The recent words of David Kopenawa Yanomami, a contemporary Amazon shaman and tribal leader, speaking about the calamitous destruction of the Amazonian forest, reflect the same awareness of kinship. I am the brother of the forest and must defend it. From another part of the world, the following story may perhaps illustrate how long atrophied faculties once connected us with the soul of nature. Next to the Patala Palace in Lhasa, there is a temple called the Lukhang, or Temple of the Serpent Spirits, that the present Dalai Lama describes as one of the hidden jewels of Tibetan civilization. This temple was the private chamber of the Dalai Lamas, the place where they retired for deep meditation. Miraculously, it has not so far been destroyed by the Chinese invasion of Tibet. The walls of the upper floor are decorated with extraordinary paintings, describing the tantric practices of the Dzogchen path to the direct experience of reality, the path practiced by the Dalai Lamas for centuries. Only these murals depict the practices that were otherwise transmitted orally and poetically referred to as the whispered lineage. Prior to the Chinese invasion of Tibet, on one day each year, the Lukhang was open to pilgrims who crossed the lake to the temple to make offerings to and invoke the blessings of the water spirits, believed to reside beneath the lake. This ritual went back to a time when the Patala Palace was being built and a deep pit had been excavated to provide mortar for the palace walls. Legend says that a female water spirit, or Naga, came to the fifth Dalai Lama, 1617 to 1682, during his meditations, and warned him that the work on the palace was destroying the Naga's ancestral home. The Dalai Lama promised that he would build and dedicate a temple to the spirits of the lake, which had formed over the desecrated land, so that their presence would be recognized and honored. In our modern world, fairy tales like The Sleeping Beauty may be the residual fragments of the forgotten participatory experience, where forests were inhabited by creatures who would help or hinder us, where spirits of tree and mountain, stream and sacred spring could speak to us and reveal the secrets of healing plants and waters, where bears or frogs might be spirits in disguise. Shamans or hermits, old women or men, living in the deep forest or mountain hermitages, might offer us wise counsel, or birds bring us messages, warning of danger and acting as guides. There are countless fairy tales, descending from ancient oral traditions, which describe how the hero or heroine who responds to the mysterious guidance of animals, or who helps them when others have ignored their requests, wins the reward of the treasure and the royal marriage. They are the creation of a different kind of consciousness, one where the mythopoetic imagination was highly cultivated, honored, and developed, and where storytellers, who were often seers, held a place of honor in the community. People in the Polynesian islands still sing to the sharks to come to the boats of the fishermen, asking their permission to kill them for food. In the sea near the Dominican Republic, a whale whisperer is able to communicate with the whales in this, their breeding ground. The Maori shamans of New Zealand still believe that everything has its own life force. The stone has the life force of the earth itself, the bone the life force of all living things, the shell the life force of the sea. In carving these elements of life with the patterns they observe in nature, they carry this insight into their work, believing that it brings healing power to the wearer and to the community. The life of the stone, bone, or shell is never lost. Its energy lives on in the wearer of the carving and is transmitted to the observer. Out of this profound relationship with the landscape and its creatures in different parts of the world, myths developed specific to the people who inhabited it for millennia. As Frederick Turner so brilliantly expressed in his book Beyond Geography, The Western Spirit Against the Wilderness, living myth must include and speak of the interlocking cycles of animate and vegetable life, of water, sun, and even the stones, which have their own stories. It must embrace without distinction the phenomenal and the numinous. This is something that has been forgotten, and that is why we have no living myth today. The shamanic experience in pre-Socratic Greece. Right at the root of European civilization, we can discover the presence of this ancient shamanic transmission in Egypt. The Egyptians, like the later Greeks, whose greatest philosophers they influenced, knew that the many gods and goddesses they worshipped personified the hidden powers that they were able to identify as elements or agents of a divinely ordered cosmos. We have simply no idea how the Egyptians developed their knowledge of the geometric and mathematical principles which governed an intelligent, sentient cosmos, nor how they were able to incorporate this knowledge in their greatest buildings. In Greece, the rituals of the Orphic and Eleusinian mysteries which kept alive the essence of the lunar participatory experience strengthened the sense of participation in an unseen reality and gave initiates an experience of immortality and the omnipresence of the soul. The poet Pindar said of them, "Blessed are they who have seen these things. They know the end of life, and they know the God-given beginnings." Apart from the mysteries, certain of the pre-Socratic Greek philosophers of the 6th century BC carry forward the legacy of the lunar experience. The words of Heraclitus, when he suggests that the soul is unfathomable depth, retain the essence of that ancient perception. Thales of Miletus speaks of the all as being alive and full of daemons, who are the agents of the one soul substance. Anaximenes says that humanity and nature are fundamentally inseparable, because both participate in the same underlying substance, which he calls soul. Pythagoras, 569 to 475 BC, after he was exiled from Greece to Crotona on the east coast of southern Italy, having spent 40 years with the astronomer priests of Egypt and Babylon, defined the mathematical laws which embodied the intelligence, wisdom, and mathematical harmony of the divine order of the cosmos. He left these words to encourage us: "Take heart, for the human race is divine." In a book called In the Dark Places of Wisdom, the classical scholar Dr. Peter Kingsley describes the treasure of wisdom bequeathed to the West by Parmenides, circa 515 to circa 450 BC, who was born at Velia in southern Italy, a city now known to have been sacred to the goddess Persephone. Parmenides was one of the greatest of the pre-Socratic philosophers. Only a few fragments of his teaching survive, and we know of them mainly through Plato's Parmenides and later commentaries. But he did leave a poem, an extraordinary poem, written in the incantatory meter that was used to draw people into another state of consciousness. Poetry created, Kingsley writes, under divine inspiration, revealing what humans on their own can never see or know, describing the world of gods and the world of humans, and meetings between humans and gods. This poem is a key to understanding the shamanic experience of that time. Parmenides, like Pythagoras, was skilled in the practice of incubation, whereby a person wanting to enter into another dimension of reality, or request a vision or a visitation from a god or goddess, withdrew into a cave or underground room or enclosed space, sometimes for days on end. He would have used techniques of chanting and breath control to give him access to a transcendent dimension of reality. What is so interesting is that, as Kingsley writes, objects and inscriptions have been found which show the continuity of these shamanic traditions and practices extending from Greece right through Asia to India, Tibet, Nepal, and as far as Mongolia. Parmenides' poem describes his shamanic journey into that other dimension of reality in a chariot drawn by mares and guided by young women, daughters of the sun, through immense doors which stretch from earth to heaven and open on oiled hinges into the yawning chasm of the underworld. He speaks of his encounter there with someone whom he simply calls the goddess, although we know that her name is Persephone. As Kingsley writes, every single figure Parmenides encounters in his poem is a woman or a girl. Even the animals are female. The universe he describes is a feminine one. The poem begins, "The mares that carry me as far as longing can reach, rode on. Once they had come and fetched me onto the legendary road of the divinity that carries the man who knows, through the vast and dark unknown." What Parmenides' poem reveals is that he was a master of the shamanic art of travelling, taking him as far as longing can reach into the darkness and mystery of the immortal realm, and that his writings about truth, justice, and the right ordering of human existence were derived from his actual experience of that other dimension of reality and his encounter there with the goddess. It also suggests that the great divide that exists in our culture between the rational and the non-rational did not exist in his time and does not need to exist now. It is a barrier created by our fear of the unknown and our tendency to disparage the existence of dimensions of reality of which we no longer have knowledge or experience. The names of a lineage of shaman healers descending from Parmenides through some 500 years have recently been discovered in Valia, carved on a single large stone. These men paid close attention to dreams, their own dreams, and the dreams of those who came to them for healing of mind or body. And this tradition of the healing dream was developed in the 300 Aesculapian sanctuaries in Greece. 3 titles describe these healer initiates. The title Iatromantis meant a healer of a particular kind, one who could enter a dimension of reality that is beyond waking and dreaming, yet is present in both. The title Pholakos, meaning Lord of the Lair, or Master of the technique of incubation, through which they gained their power to heal and to become lawgivers. The title Uliades meant priest of Apollo, an apostle who was not the god of light and reason familiar to us, but a god associated with healing, the underworld, and what lies beyond the threshold of death. As Lord of the Lair, Apollo presided over the caves where the rites of incubation were practiced at dead of night, rites that originated on the western coast of Anatolia and descended from a shamanic tradition long established there. It was from these rites of incubation and their journeying into another world that Parmenides and those that preceded and followed him received their teachings about truth, justice, and the laws, which are necessary for the right ordering of society. These teachings and the shamanic method of accessing them were lost with the emphasis given to the rational mind, derived from later interpretations of Plato's writings. Because of Plato's immense influence, the insights and experience of Parmenides were lost to Western civilization. Plato and the loss of the shamanic transmission. For it was the legacy of Plato, 429 to 347 BC, rather than that of Parmenides, which was to become the foundation of Western civilization, and it is difficult to determine why Plato discarded the shamanic tradition, known to the man who is said to be his teacher and mentor. Plato stands at the watershed between the lunar and the solar eras, between what we now recognize as two phases in the evolution of consciousness, one grounded in a close participatory relationship with nature and an unseen order of reality, the other drawing away from nature with the emphasis on reason and the rational mind. From the perspective of the evolution of consciousness in the West, Plato initiates a profound change, a change that may already have been well established among the cultural elite of Athens. The emphasis of his prolific writings, set down over an expanse of 40 years, is not on the shamanic experience described by Parmenides, but, following the method of dialogue used by Socrates, on the development of the intellectual rigor that Socrates considered essential for man to gain insight into the divine realities of the eternal forms, those same realities which Parmenides had gained access to by a different route. By the word nous, Plato did not mean the rational intellect or the mind, but the direct apprehension of the divine forms, the world of archetypal realities. Yet it was surely from the shamanic participatory experience of an ensouled world that Plato, in his Timaeus, drew his concept of the soul of the cosmos, psyche to cosmo, which he described as a single living creature that encompasses all the living creatures that are within it. He speaks of a great chain of being as a hierarchy of participations, descending from a pre-existing template of eternal forms to the forms of this phenomenal world. The idea of hierarchy is new. We lose the concept of the shamanic sense of relationship with the other world, and the ability to travel into it known to Parmenides, and are introduced to the Socratic idea that a highly developed quality of the intellect, honed through discussion, the exercise of logic, and the testing of hypotheses, is the key to the opening of human consciousness, to the recovery of our lost memory, of the transcendent world of the eternal forms. The philosopher Jeremy Nadler observes in The Future of the Ancient World that for Plato, the spiritual source, both of the natural world and of ourselves, is to be found by ascending away from the body and all sensory experience, and travelling in a state of consciousness free of the body, into a dimension of existence beyond that of which we are normally aware. This dimension is the purely spiritual world of forms or ideas, from which both the forms in the natural world and the thoughts in our minds derive. Secondly, in Plato's view, the truly spiritual does not participate in matter. It is not tainted by immersion or involvement in matter. Although the archetypal world of eternal forms is connected to this world through a hierarchy of relationships, and although the cosmos is ensouled, the dimension of the eternal forms does not participate in this material world. This distinction is absolutely crucial for an understanding of the Western philosophical tradition that developed from Plato. It is also crucial for an understanding of the religions of the axial age, which began around 500 BC, and which turned away from nature, the world, and sensory experience towards a transcendent and, in the three patriarchal religions, monotheistic concept of spirit. Nadler summarizes the tendency to reject this world and the sensory perception which holds us to it. In order to participate in the true reality, from which what appears real to us derives, we must sever our connection with the material world and sense-based consciousness. We cannot experience our true self on earth. It is necessary to go upward and backward in a movement of self-recovery, which transports the soul into a pristine, pre-earthly state of self-remembrance. Plato's message is an initiatory one. We must learn to die to our incarnate selves, for death is the secret of life. Plato's thought carries the idea that every individual soul holds within it the memory of the divine world. But on entering this world and being imprisoned in the body, it forgets what it once knew. The aim of philosophy was to reawaken in the soul awareness of its divine origins, awareness of the eternal causal world, through a quest for knowledge of the true, the good, and the beautiful. In Book 7 of his Republic, he uses the graphic metaphor of the cave, discovering how human beings are condemned to live there like prisoners, seeing on the walls the flickering shadows of the realities that can only be seen on leaving the cave. He wrote these telling words in the Phaedrus: "Pure was the light, and pure were we from the pollution of the walking sepulchre, which we call a body, to which we are bound like an oyster to its shell." It is strange that the cave, which was the place of revelation for Parmenides and other shaman healers like him who travelled into the underworld, has now, with Plato, become the prison of the body. Implicit in his immensely influential definition of reality is the idea that nature, although an expression of the divine, is lower in the hierarchical chain of being than spirit, body lower than mind, and animals and plants lower on the scale of being than humans. This is a radical departure from the experience of shamanic cultures, where nature was sacred, because it was the dwelling place of spirit, where access to the invisible world, underlying the world of form, was found through a sacred place in the physical world, and through shamanic techniques of incubation, connection, and entering that other world, never through a rejection of the physical world or the rejection of sensory experience. Moreover, in Plato's philosophy, the soul is divided into a rational and an irrational part, with the first having primacy over the second. The instincts and emotions which derive from them are associated with the irrational or animal soul, and relegated to a level far beneath the rational soul that is associated with the mind. From now on, the testimony of sensory experience, the instinctive sensory experience of the body, participating in the matrix of nature, is deemed to be inferior and unreliable in relation to the rational mind, and a radical separation develops between mind and body. One could say that nature and body are henceforth excluded from the sacred order, excluded from the dimension of soul and spirit. It is possible that the split which was beginning to develop between nature and spirit, and that is already clearly apparent in Plato's writing, was the direct effect of the accelerating separation of the developing ego from the instinctive, participatory consciousness of the lunar era. Plato's important definition of an all-embracing cosmic soul, and his emphasis on the divine qualities of truth, goodness, and beauty, bequeathed to Western civilization vitally important concepts. However, because of the separation of the world of the eternal forms from this material world, there is a fading of the feeling of participation in an ensouled world, a disjunction between spiritual and sensory experience, an emphasis on rational discourse rather than the experience of the numinous, that is the main characteristic of shamanic cultures, and that in Greece reached its highest expression in Pythagoras and Parmenides and the chain of shaman healers who preceded and followed them. Dr. Kingsley comments, "For thousands of years now, the beginnings of Western philosophy had systematically been split off and dissociated from the kind of practices we've come to think of as magical. The process has been a long and determined one. It has almost succeeded. But those ancient connections are calling out again to be acknowledged. Although it carried forward the existence of the world of spirit in the idea of the eternal forms, this new philosophy, with its emphasis on freeing the soul from the prison of the body, did not retain the shamanic understanding that the visible world was permeated by an invisible, eternal ground, that this world exists within the eternal world. An absolutely essential understanding was lost. The fundamental disjunction between soul and body in Platonic thought was transmitted to Christian theology, which increasingly split matter from spirit, body from soul, sensory from spiritual experience, and saw the body as the main impediment to the spiritual life. This split was to have disastrous and far-reaching effects on Western civilization and on the relations between man and woman, for man was identified with the spirit and the rational mind, and woman with nature and the irrational passions of the body. It may seem an act of sacrilege to suggest that Plato's philosophy transmitted this split. However, I feel that its effect on the developing psyche of Western civilization needs to be noted. For Plato created an elaborate philosophical structure of thought which resulted in the movement away from nature and the immanence of spirit, towards the idealization of the world of archetypal or eternal forms and the pursuit of reason and knowledge as the way to access this transcendent spiritual world. Through Plato's influence, though not, I am sure, his intention, Western civilization was destined to develop on the foundation of a radical split between spirit and nature, between the exalted Apollonian rational mind and the feared Dionysian passions of the body, and this split is still embedded in our thinking today. Christianity turned daemons into demons, ignoring the stark warning of Plutarch, circa AD 46 to 120. Whoever denies the daemons breaks the chain that links the gods to man. Ian McGilchrist, in a remarkable book called The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World, which explores the difference between the perception of the right and left hemispheres of the brain, observes that this separation of the absolute and eternal, which can be known as logos, reason, from the purely phenomenological, which is now seen as inferior, leaves an indelible stamp on the history of Western philosophy for the subsequent 2,000 years. Yet it should perhaps be remembered that Plato bequeathed to us the idea of our separation from and need for reunion with the divine world, and this vitally important idea can be traced through Western literature and philosophy, and is emerging today in our modern world. There is another important aspect of this story which concerns the philosophy of Aristotle, 384 to 322 BC. I have turned again to Jeremy Nadler's book, mentioned above, for his understanding of Aristotle, who was engaged by Philip of Macedon to be the tutor of his son, later to become Alexander the Great. Aristotle's philosophy was radically different from Plato's and retained the older shamanic insight that nature is the manifestation of spirit and that spirit is the active principle within all matter. Plato gave his allegiance to soul, Aristotle to matter. It was Aristotle who laid the ground for the exploration of the natural world, the search for the hidden laws of nature, and the astonishing discoveries of modern science. Unlike Plato, he did not separate sensory from spiritual experience. Rather, he saw the archetypal principles of the eternal world fully embodied in the world of matter. As Jeremy Nadler observes, in his philosophy is enshrined a spirituality that does not require an ascent to the heavens in order to discover the spiritual source either of the world or of ourselves, for spirit is engaged in the world and can be discovered everywhere in nature. For Aristotle, nature is the outpouring of spirit, which is the active or creative principle in all things. The sense-perceptible world is not a copy or pale imitation of a transcendent world of spiritual archetypes. Rather, these archetypes are embodied in the sense-perceptible world. Spirit is utterly committed to nature. Furthermore, in human consciousness, spirit has the possibility of knowing and recognizing itself. Aristotle refers to this in his 12th book of the Metaphysics, where he describes the meditative act in which a transcendent self-consciousness is attained without travelling to the stars, a self-consciousness in which universal spirit comes to know itself in and through human consciousness. I think this remarkable insight is what is being experienced now within many thousands of people, spirit awakening to awareness of itself within our human consciousness. And all this comes about not through rejecting the body and sensory experience, but through a profound sense of the unfolding of Spirit's plan within the context of nature and human existence. Nadler continues, an acceptance of our embodiment, of our belonging to the earth, runs through Aristotle's philosophy, just as an unwillingness to accept the reality of incarnate life runs through the writings of Plato. For Aristotle, spirit has made its habitation here on earth. It is part of the destiny of spirit to become implicated in matter. Spirit and matter together make the world. Aristotle is too much in love with the world to see withdrawal from it as a valid spiritual path, and his work is imbued with the intention to discover the working of the divine within the natural world. The two emphases of his philosophy are on pursuing knowledge of nature and on developing a thoroughly grounded ethics. As regards the former, he seeks everywhere the working of the divine within the natural world. As regards the latter, the basis of right action is brought back to the spiritual intuition of the free and fully responsible human agent. We have here not only an agenda for science, but an agenda for the creation of an ethical relationship between the human community and the natural world, something that is being worked out in many communities worldwide, even if it has not yet fully entered into the world of science or politics. Aristotle grasps the fact that humanity has entered a new stage in the unfolding cosmological drama, and that this stage is to do with the infinite rediscovering itself within the sphere of the finite. In human understanding, Aristotle sees a cosmic and eternal activity at work within human consciousness. The source of human thinking is infinite, but it is locked within the confines of finitude. Human beings thus have a vital mediating role of releasing the infinite from its entanglement within the finite, thereby allowing the divine to know itself within the human. Centuries later, the rescue and release of spirit, deeply buried within matter, was to become the major theme of the great work of alchemy. Although the fact of the spirit's presence within nature was recognized by shamanic peoples in many parts of the world, not in the scientific sense, but instinctively, intuitively, and by actual experience, in Christian civilization it was a heresy to regard nature as animated by spirit. So this insight, originating in the older shamanic cultures and carefully transmitted from generation to generation, had to go underground for many centuries.
Once, long ago, the soul was understood in its widest sense as an unseen order of reality, which was the ground of this world, ensouling both nature and the cosmos. It was the great matrix of being to which we belonged, in whose life we lived. Soul was the unseen life of nature and the cosmos, but its visible manifestation was this phenomenal world, which was never regarded as inferior to or separate from spirit, as it was later to become in the solar era. It was infused with spirit, permeated by spirit, an epiphany or showing forth of spirit. I will return to this theme in chapter 15. These 2 chapters have described the profound relationship we once had with the earth and the cosmos. The indigenous peoples of the world did not lose this relationship and are urgently trying to reawaken us to it. So much knowledge of the profound divinity and sacredness of life has been lost. To recover this knowledge and transform our view of reality, we need to recover the lost lunar vision and give it new expression in our time, so that we might enter the phase that Owen Barfield called final participation, when the lunar and solar aspects of our consciousness are reunited and taken to a new level through our reconnection with everything from which we have become separated. Jung understood this need when he wrote, "Nothing to which the psyche belongs or which is part of the psyche is ever lost. To live fully, we have to reach down and bring back to life the deepest levels of the psyche from which our present consciousness has evolved. But to do this, we need to understand the solar era and why its view of reality was utterly different from that of the lunar one, why and how we moved from seeing nature as animate and ensouled to seeing it as subject to our dominance and control."
Part 3. The Disassociated Psyche, the Pathology of Separation and Loss. The feminine archetype associated with nature, soul, and body is split off from spirit. Nature is de-souled. Nature and the earth are no longer sacred. Woman is identified with nature, man with spirit. Nature and woman become subject to man. Sexuality is sinful. Body is split off from mind, and mind from soul. Chapter 6. The Solar Era. The separation from nature and the battle between good and evil. The story of mind, exiled from nature, is the story of Western man. Ted Hughes. In the story of the development of Western civilization from around 2000 BC, we begin to see the beginning of a new phase in the evolution of human consciousness and a change of focus from a lunar to a solar mythology. This era, which has been equated with the rise of civilization, actually reflects a complete eclipse of the participatory experience of the lunar era, taking over many of the older lunar myths and stories and setting them in a new solar context. The dominant celestial body is now the sun rather than the moon, and the dominant mythology is solar rather than lunar. The primary theme of lunar mythology is a cyclical process of birth, death, and regeneration. The theme of solar mythology is a great battle between light and darkness, good and evil. Whereas the focus of the lunar culture is on an ensouled cosmos and mythic participation in the life of a sacred order, the focus of solar culture is on the conquest and mastery of nature, the development of the rational mind, and the differentiation of the outstanding individual from the tribal group. It is, above all, the age of the individual, and specifically the warrior, who dons the mantle of the solar hero. As this process of solarization develops, linear time begins to replace cyclical time, and a linear, literal, and objective way of thinking slowly begins to replace the older participatory way of knowing and its imaginal, relational way of thinking. It is customary to look upon this new era as a progressive advance or ascent for humanity, emerging from an older and more primitive era, characterized by savage customs and magical thinking. I see it as a time of immense cultural and technological achievement, but also, as D.H. Lawrence did, as a time of ever-increasing loss of the sense of participation in the sacred order of an ensouled world. In his book Apocalypse and Other Writings, 1931, he despairingly wrote, "We have lost the cosmos by coming out of responsive connection with it, and this is our chief tragedy. We and the cosmos are one. The cosmos is a vast living body of which we are still parts. What is our petty little love of nature? Nature, compared to the ancient, magnificent living with the cosmos and being honored by the cosmos."
A later Babylonian creation myth, circa 1700, called the Enuma Elish, tells the story of a young god called Marduk, clothed with the radiance of 10 gods, with a majesty to inspire fear, who kills Tiamat, the great dragoness mother, by shooting an arrow into her open mouth, which tears her belly and splits her heart. Marduk throws her carcass on the ground, stands on it and cuts it in half like a fish, creating the sky from one half of her dismembered body and the earth from the other. He then creates the planets and the constellations. Almost as an afterthought, he creates humanity from the blood of Tiamat's murdered son. The myth was recited annually at the spring equinox, a time when the floods which covered the Babylonian plain in winter were receding, when the power of the sun warmed the earth, and the spring sowing of the crops could begin. The recitation of the myth was believed to strengthen the forces of light against the forces of darkness in the great annual battle that took place between them, so regenerating life for the new year. A myth grew up around this annual event, the myth of a solar hero who defeats the forces of darkness and evil that were personified by a dragon or monster of the underworld. This myth was transmitted to other, later cultures, and is still very much alive in our own. This new and violent Babylonian creation myth was in stark contrast to the older Bronze Age Sumerian and Egyptian creation myths, and it reflects a loss of relationship with the natural world and a harsh severance of the lunar way of thinking. It was a dangerous myth to take literally, for it offered the image of violence and murder as a pattern of divine behavior, ratifying it as a model for human beings to emulate. Marduk became the macho ideal, the model for all solar heroes to come. With this myth, the imagery of conflict and opposition between light and darkness, good and evil, is constellated. At the same time, in the context of war, the practice of wholesale human slaughter becomes widespread, recorded and celebrated by the victor both in texts and in graphic sculptures on palace and temple walls. The story of a hero's fight with a dragon, widely disseminated throughout the Middle East and the Eastern Mediterranean and deeply imprinted on the psyche of that age, laid the mythological ground for the future polarization of spirit and nature, mind and body, the one seen as divine and good, the other as fallen and evil. This divinely sanctioned opposition led to the idea of the Holy War, the war of the forces of good against the forces of evil, which is deeply interwoven with the sacred texts of the 3 patriarchal religions and their behavior towards their enemies. Marduk's triumphant victory over Tiamat initiated a new way of living, a new way of relating to the divine by exalting an ideology of power and conquest. The battle of a hero god and his conquest of the dragon monster of darkness, chaos, and evil became the dominant theme of all the hero myths of the solar era, from Marduk to the hero myth of our own time that is being played out before our eyes on the world stage. The idea of opposition and conflict between light and darkness, good and evil, is constellated, and this solar mythology pervades the Old Testament and other mythologies of the Iron Age, such as those of India, the Mahabharata, and Persia, the conflict between Ormuzd and Ahriman. In Greece we find it in the myths of the sun god Apollo, slaying the she-dragon that guarded the sacred spring at Delphi, Theseus killing the Minotaur, and Perseus the Gorgon. It is dramatically portrayed in the book of Revelation as the great battle fought at the end of time between St. Michael and the dragon. Already, it is possible to sense that the earth, identified with both the defeated goddess and the dragon, who represents the untamed forces of nature, is no longer sacred. It is a shocking possibility that one immensely powerful myth and its derivatives could alter our relationship to earth and cosmos, and cast a spell on humanity that has endured for nearly 4,000 years.
The solar myth. The cosmic battle between light and darkness. There is one powerful myth that lies at the root of the solar era. It comes down to us from the mythology of Mesopotamia, Persia, and Greece. Its theme is a hero's struggle with a mighty dragon or serpent, and the cosmic battle between light and darkness, good and evil. Right at the beginning of the solar era, in the Sumerian epic of Gilgamesh, we encounter the first myth of a hero's fight with a dragon, monster, or serpent. This myth became the dominant one of the solar era, entering into religions, philosophies, and innumerable conflicts and conquests. It contributed to the yawning chasm between nature and spirit, and between mind and body. It gave rise to the belief that man is engaged in a great battle to conquer, subdue, and control nature, so losing the participatory consciousness of the lunar era. Within the psyche, it contributed to, and also reflected, the splitting asunder of the conscious, rational mind and the instinctual soul. It gave rise ultimately to the one-eyed consciousness of the present time that will be described in chapter 9. The Epic of Gilgamesh may have originated as early as about 2300 BC and gives the first known account of the Great Flood. Gilgamesh, king of the Sumerian city of Uruk, a city girded by mighty walls, defies the express warning of the gods and sets out with his companion Enkidu to kill Humbaba, guardian of the great cedar forest of the goddess Ishtar. The two heroes will not listen to Humbaba's pleas for mercy and kill him. They then cut down the forest. Soon after, Enkidu falls ill and dies. Gilgamesh, grief-stricken, sets out to find the herb or flower of immortality, but falls asleep on his way back to his city and loses it to a serpent, who, smelling its sweetness, rises up out of a well and seizes it. So powerful is the description in this ancient text that as we read the words, we can still feel the intense grief of Gilgamesh's loss. Was it for this that I toiled with my hands? Is it for this that I have wrung out my heart's blood? For myself I have gained nothing, not I, but the beast of the earth has joy of it now. A later Babylonian creation myth, about 1700 BC, called the Enuma Elish, tells the story of a young god called Marduk, clothed with the radiance of 10 gods, with a majesty to inspire fear, who kills Tiamat, the great dragoness mother, by shooting an arrow into her open mouth, which tears her belly and splits her heart. Marduk throws her carcass on the ground, stands on it, and cuts it in half like a fish, creating the sky from one half of her dismembered body and the earth from the other. He then creates the planets and the constellations. Almost as an afterthought, he creates humanity from the blood of Tiamat's murdered son. The myth was recited annually at the spring equinox, a time when the floods which covered the Babylonian plain in winter were receding, when the power of the sun warmed the earth, and the spring sowing of the crops could begin. The recitation of the myth was believed to strengthen the forces of light against the forces of darkness in the great annual battle that took place between them, so regenerating life for the new year. A myth grew up around this annual event, the myth of a solar hero who defeats the forces of darkness and evil that were personified by a dragon or monster of the underworld. This myth was transmitted to other later cultures and is still very much alive in our own. The new and violent Babylonian creation myth was in stark contrast to the older Bronze Age Sumerian and Egyptian creation myths, and it reflects a loss of relationship with the natural world and a harsh severance of the lunar way of thinking. It was a dangerous myth to take literally, for it offered the image of violence and murder as a pattern of divine behavior, ratifying it as a model for human beings to emulate. Marduk becomes the Mako ideal, the model for all solar heroes to come. With this myth, the imagery of conflict and opposition between light and darkness, good and evil, is constellated. At the same time, in the context of war, the practice of wholesale human slaughter becomes widespread, recorded and celebrated by the victor, both in texts and in graphic sculptures on palace and temple walls. The story of a hero's fight with a dragon, widely disseminated throughout the Middle East and Eastern Mediterranean, and deeply imprinted on the psyche of that age, laid the mythological ground for the future polarization of spirit and nature, mind and body, the one seen as divine and good, the other as fallen and evil. This divinely sanctioned opposition led also to the idea of the holy war, the war of the forces of good against the forces of evil, which is deeply interwoven with the sacred texts of the three patriarchal religions and their behavior towards their enemies. Marduk's triumphant victory over Tiamat initiated a new way of living, a new way of relating to the divine by exalting an ideology of power and conquest. The battle of a hero god and his conquest of the dragon monster of darkness, chaos, and evil became the dominant theme of all the hero myths of the solar era, from Marduk to the hero myth of our own time that is being played out before our eyes on the world stage. The idea of opposition and conflict between light and darkness, good and evil, is constellated, and this solar mythology pervades the Old Testament and other mythologies of the Iron Age, such as those of India, the Mahabharata, and Persia, the conflict between Ormuzd and Ahriman. In Greece, we find it in the myths of the sun god Apollo slaying the she-dragon that guarded the sacred spring at Delphi, Theseus killing the Minotaur, and Perseus the Gorgon. It is dramatically portrayed in the book of Revelation as the great battle fought at the end of time between Saint Michael and the dragon. Already it is possible to sense that the earth, identified with both the defeated goddess and the dragon, who represents the untamed forces of nature, is no longer sacred. It is a shocking possibility that one immensely powerful myth and its derivatives could alter our relationship to earth and cosmos, and cast a spell on humanity that has endured for nearly 4,000 years. A new worldview. It is impossible to overstate the importance of this change of focus for the future relationship between man and nature. The coming of the solar era reflects the formulation of an entirely new perception of life, and with it the rise of a new meta-narrative or worldview, whose theme is the cosmic battle between light and darkness, good and evil. With the diffusion of solar mythology, hastened by the advent of literacy and the discovery of the many applications of bronze technology, particularly those related to arms and war, The earlier, lunar sense of a mythic participation in the continual regeneration of the life of the earth and the greater life of the cosmos gradually fades. The lunar idea of the balance between light and darkness was lost in the solar idea of opposition between them. For the next 4,000 years, nature becomes something to be conquered and controlled and manipulated by human ingenuity to human advantage. Once alive with spirit, it is now de-souled. Body is disconnected from mind, and mind from soul. The myth of the fall in the book of Genesis, chapter 7, describes the process of estrangement, separation, and loss, a stark reversal of the participatory way of knowing that characterized older, pre-literate lunar cultures. As Jules and I observed in the myth of the goddess, nature is no longer experienced as source, but as adversary, and darkness is no longer a mode of divine being as it was in the lunar cycles, but a mode of being devoid of divinity and actively hostile, devouring of light, clarity, and order. If we relate this change of worldview to what is happening within the psyche during this time, we can read the story of the human ego, the solar hero, striving to differentiate itself from the matrix of nature and attempting to master and control that from which it had emerged. The drama of the solar quest for light and enlightenment and victory over darkness is the drama of our own heroic quest for consciousness and our fear of falling back into the darkness of unconsciousness, the darkness of the state of nature. From the ego's perspective, the darkness had to be repudiated and conquered for the light to prevail, a concept utterly different from the earlier belief where the darkness of the other world was a mystery to be entered and explored. The emphasis during this age is on the masculine archetype, because the ego needed to identify itself with this archetype in order to differentiate itself from the mother, the matrix of nature and instinct. But we may question whether it needed to do so in such a violent and oppositional way, and whether this process became pathological because of the influence of the dominant mythology and trauma inflicted by the continual wars and conflicts of this era. Political and social change. There were two other major factors contributing to the change from lunar to solar mythology. One was political, the other the impact of literacy. Around 2200 BC, there was a tremendous, devastating change which fell like a thunderbolt from a blue sky on the agricultural communities of the Fertile Crescent. The whole region was thrown into turmoil. Invaders, bringing male gods, a people whose onslaught was like a hurricane, as one scribe depicts them, swept into the river valleys where the Great Mother had been worshipped for thousands of years. They brought with them the horse and the war chariot. Some came down from the north via the passage between the Black and Caspian seas. Others moved into the area from the Arabian desert. Still others, known as the Sea Peoples, invaded from the Mediterranean. War and conquest became the theme of a new and terrifying age. Everywhere there was fear and slaughter. Everywhere a great cry of terror and distress, as people were murdered, enslaved, their cities and homes burnt, their livelihoods destroyed. The cruelty and slaughter that accompanied the imposition of a new order was triumphantly recorded in the annals of the Babylonian and later the Assyrian kings. What is being experienced in Syria now is comparable to what was experienced then. The theme of this new age was conquest, not yet conquest in the name of religion, but conquest in the name of acquiring and enlarging territory, acquiring power. King Sargon of Akkad, 2300 BC, was the first proudly to record his conquest of the vast area of land between the two seas, the Mediterranean and the Persian Gulf. He set the model for the kings and emperors who were to succeed him as they built the great empires of the future, Babylonian, Assyrian, Persian, Greek, and Roman. It is now thought that around 2200 BC, climate change, resulting in widespread drought and famine over a vast area, led people to abandon their lands and move into areas where food was still plentiful. Whatever the ultimate causes of this turbulent time, and famine may have been one of them in the regions from which the invaders came, war and violence became endemic in the area of the eastern Mediterranean, including Turkey, then Anatolia, and the Middle East, modern Iraq. Through Egyptian, Babylonian, and Assyrian history, we follow the rise of the warlike leader who was idealized and glorified for his prowess in battle and the defeat of his enemies. Assyrian and Egyptian palace and temple walls show the Assyrian king or pharaoh standing in their chariots engaged in battle, their decapitated or bound enemies ranged in rows at their feet. The ethnic cleansing of 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel, circa 720 BC, by the Assyrians is part of this somber story. The siege and sack of Troy gives us graphic insight into the theme of war, which increasingly dominates this era. We can trace this pattern of conquest through the Persian, Greek, and Roman empires, and later through all the struggles for power between tribal groups and nations that took place on European soil, as well as in the vast region between Europe and China. We can imagine the suffering it induced as thousands were slaughtered, displaced, widowed, orphaned. Throughout this time there is massive social dislocation and political change. The movement to cities and the rapid growth of populations, the rise of the city-state and then the nation-state, the advent of centralized bureaucracies and powerful priesthoods, the transformation of farmers into serfs, the enslavement of prisoners of war, and the ethnic cleansing and mass removal of entire conquered populations. Solar mythology led ultimately to the idea of the holy war, the victory of the forces of good over the forces of evil, and to the idea that human sacrifice was justifiable and acceptable to God when it served the purpose of eradicating evil in the form of a designated enemy. Hence, the medieval onslaught of Christianity against Islam and the later efforts of the Christian Church to extirpate the evil of heresy. Hence, Islam's belief in conquest in the name of Allah and the slaughter of the infidel. Victory was the coveted prize bestowed by God, and God was invoked by both sides to support the battle of good against evil. Wherever today we hear the words good and evil mentioned in the context of a struggle between opposing forces, we may expect to find the old solar myth and an individual assuming the mantle of the solar hero and leading his people against the demon of darkness. We may also expect to find the ritual demonizing of an enemy and all the propaganda that accompanies the modern constellation of a battle between opposing forces. The theme of conquest, which began in the 3rd millennium BC with the conquests of King Sargon of Akkad, has been constant for 4 millennia until we reach the 20th century with Hiroshima and the horrific nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons of modern warfare. Christianity and Islam assimilated this mythology of conquest with their call to crusades and holy wars, and its legacy lingers into our own times in the crusade against the axis of evil and the Islamist jihad. It is even discovered in the manifesto put up by Breivik, the Norwegian mass murderer, 2011, in which he declares himself to be a modern crusader knight, engaged in the battle of good against evil in eliminating the Muslims from Europe. It may be difficult to accept the idea that the theme of conquest, war, and sacrifice, which characterizes this phase of separation, is pathological. From the perspective of modern psychology, it could be said to exhibit pathological symptoms, because the pattern of behavior is disassociated from any awareness of guilt or regret for the suffering inflicted by it. The defeat and humiliation of an enemy is celebrated as proof of the victor or nation's superiority and power. The defeated are murdered, enslaved, or condemned to destitution. The pattern of behavior is deeply unconscious. The coming of Christianity brought no change, as Christians soon came to see themselves as soldiers of Christ. Despite the teaching on the forbidding of killing enshrined in the Ten Commandments, and the teaching of Christ enjoining his followers to forgive their enemies, there is no apparent awareness in the heat of battle that the infliction of death and suffering on other human beings might be morally wrong and against the divine order. Only very slowly has the capacity for empathy developed. Whether we look at the Iliad, the Old Testament, Deuteronomy chapter 7, the conquering ethos of early Islam, or the crusading impulse of the Christian Middle Ages in Europe, the defeat of tribal enemies was deemed pleasing to the gods, and ultimately to God. The formation of the warrior. From being primarily a hunter-gatherer in the Paleolithic and Neolithic eras, man becomes a warrior in the Bronze Age, and throughout the Solar Era. From earliest times, it is obvious that men were conditioned from childhood to develop their hunting and fighting skills and to join together with other men in order to supply the clan or tribe with food and defend them in case of attack. This deep, archaic bonding, a real devotion between men, is strongly felt today in the current conflicts in which they are called to engage. The primary training of a warrior is to obey his tribal leader. Men living in the Solar Era had warrior myths to inspire them, warrior heroes as models to follow. In the constant state of preparation for war throughout this era, every male was brought up to see fighting as natural, noble, glorious, and necessary, something in which he could prove his manhood. The regime instituted by Sparta took boys away from their families for military training at 7, not to return them until they were 18 and ready for war. Military training turned boys into warriors who would help to build the great empires their warrior kings felt impelled to carve out. To shed blood was to be initiated into the brotherhood of warriors. To show fear or weakness was to be branded a woman, weak, cowardly, dispensable. This was the ideology into which men were indoctrinated from a very early age throughout the Solar Era. It is not that men were innately aggressive and drawn to war. It is that the habit of war throughout this era conditioned them to conform or suffer shame, ridicule, and rejection by their tribal or national group, even up to the First World War, when deserters or cowards were shot. Sam Keane observes in his book, Fire in the Belly, on being a man, a culture that is at war or constantly preparing for a possible war conspires to create perception, especially amongst its male citizens, that the threat from the enemy is always present. And again, the warrior finds the meaning of his life in playing a part in an overarching story of the cosmic struggle between good and evil. The warrior's eye and mind narrow to stereotypes that reduce the enemy to an entity that can be defeated or killed without remorse. In the heat of battle, it is either kill or be killed. Faced with an enemy, the warrior discovers the power, necessity, and raw courage of the primal battle to survive in the same way that an animal experiences them when confronted with a dangerous predator. For over 4,000 years, under the powerful influence of solar mythology, victory and the spoils of war were seen as the coveted treasure to be won in battle. Courage in battle became the supreme virtue in the warrior, and the image of the warrior was accepted as the supreme role model for men. Alexander the Great, 356 to 323 BC, a warrior of warriors, was born into a warrior culture. compulsively pursuing the glory of conquest after his father, Philip of Macedon, was assassinated at his daughter's wedding feast. As people moved to cities, and cities became states, and states entered into conflict with each other, more and more young men joined or were conscripted into armies led by warrior kings, and may never have seen their homeland again. The archetype of the solar hero as warrior still exerts immense unconscious influence on the modern male psyche, in the battlefield of politics, as well as that of corporate business, and even in the world of science and academia. The primary aim of the male is to achieve, to win, and if necessary, to defeat other males. The ideal of the warrior has become an unconscious part of every man's identity from the time he is a small child. With the mythic theme of the cosmic battle between good and evil, and the indoctrination of the warrior, went the focus on war and territorial conquest. War has been endemic throughout the 4,000 years of the solar era. The glorification of war and conquest, and the exaltation of the warrior is a major theme of the solar era, still with us today in George W. Bush's words in 2005. We will accept no outcome except victory. This call to victory echoes down the centuries, ensuring that the hecatombs of young warriors were sacrificed to the god of war, countless millions led into captivity and slavery, countless women raped and widows left destitute. It has sanctioned an ethos that strives for victory at no matter what cost in human lives, and even today glorifies war and admires the warrior leader. This archaic model of tribal dominance and conquest has inflicted untold suffering on humanity, and now threatens our very survival as a species. The cosmic battle between light and darkness was increasingly projected into the world, and a fascination with territorial conquest gripped the imagination and led to the creation of vast empires. It is as if the heroic human ego, identified with the solar hero, had to seek out new territories to conquer, had to embody the myth in a literal sense, and as it did so, channel the primitive territorial drives of the psyche into a Dionysian orgy of unbridled conquest, slaughter, and destruction. We hear very little about the suffering generated by these conquests, the weeping widows, the mothers who lost sons, the orphaned children, and the crops and patterns of sowing and harvesting devastated and disrupted by the foraging armies passing over them, the exquisite works of art pillaged and looted, the utter destruction of the wonderful city of Persepolis by Alexander the Great was one legacy of this solar dynamic.
Slavery. With the creation of empires went the establishment of slavery as a method of subduing conquered people, following the model offered by Babylonia and Assyria, Egypt and the Hittites. We know the fate of thousands of women and children from the description in the Iliad of Andromache, seeing her young son thrown from the walls of the palace of King Priam, and bewailing the destiny that was to befall her and the women of Troy. Men were forced to become serfs, women concubines or sex slaves. Children were separated from their parents and sold as slaves. Their suffering, which would have included rape of both boys and girls, can only be imagined. The story in the forging of any of the great empires of the Iron Age was the same: power, land, and riches for the conqueror, death, slavery, and destitution for the conquered.
The impact of literacy. A second major influence in the solar era was the impact of literacy. The written word replaced the oral tradition that had carried the wisdom and insights of the older lunar culture. Some of that ancient wisdom may have been recorded in the thousands of scrolls held in the great library of Alexandria, but in 391 AD the Emperor Theodosius decreed that all pagan temples, including those at Eleusis and Ephesus, should be destroyed. The legendary fire, which is said to have wiped out the Library of Alexandria, and with it the priceless store of scrolls holding the legacy of the pre-Christian world, may have taken place at this time. The legacy of the shamanic cultures, particularly that derived from the formidable civilization of Egypt, went underground, surviving, however, in the Hermetic tradition and in Kabbalah and alchemy. David Abraham has shown in his book, The Spell of the Sensuous, how the new emphasis on the written word contributed to the loss of the older, participatory consciousness. Only as the written text began to speak would the voices of the forest and of the river begin to fade, and only then would language loosen its ancient association with the invisible breath, the spirit sever itself from the wind, the psyche disassociate itself from the environing air. Another book, The Alphabet and the Goddess, written by the late Dr. Leonard Shaun, who was chief of laparoscopic surgery at California Medical Center in San Francisco, develops the interesting idea that literacy gave prominence to the left hemispheric brain, to the detriment of the balance between the hemispheres that had prevailed in a pre-literate culture. He explains that when speaking, we use both hemispheres of the brain, but when written words began to supersede spoken words, the left brain's dominance was markedly increased. It may be that with literacy the importance of the seer or wise old man or woman diminished. There is an interesting footnote to this change. Socrates apparently struggled to get used to the new skill of writing. He didn't understand it and saw it as a dangerous invention because it didn't allow ideas to flow back and forth as they did in conversation. He preferred the old oral method of communicating. He also worried that it would make people appear cleverer than in fact they were, giving the impression that they knew something when they didn't. Perhaps the original definition of spin. During this era, the left hemisphere of the brain begins to assume a position of dominance in relation to the right. The more literacy spreads, the more this tendency strengthens. As Shaun observes, writing represented a shift of tectonic proportions that fissured the integrated nature of brain cooperation. Writing made the left brain, flanked by the incisive cones of the eye and the aggressive right hand, dominate over the right. The triumphant march of literacy that began 5,000 years ago conquered the right brain values, and with them the goddess. Patriarchy and misogyny have been the inevitable result. The hand that held the pen also held the sword. Perhaps because literacy distanced us from nature and from empathetic relationship with the earth, the story of creation is now believed to be in the sacred book, the supreme repository of the Word of God. The more tolerant attitude of the Greeks and even the Romans, which allowed many different cults to flourish, is replaced by a rigid adherence to the written word, the supreme repository of revelation. With the idea of a holy, transcendent God, separate and distinct from nature, the unity of life is broken. The land is no longer sacred and is divided up into empires and nations ruled by powerful kings. Absolute obedience to the written word replaces direct shamanic experience of the numinous. Ancient rituals of connection and divination are forbidden. Pagan cult images are banished under pain of death. With this shift in archetypal imagery, everything formerly associated with the Great Mother is downgraded in relation to the absolute authority of the Great Father. The lunar way of knowing is subjugated to the solar way, and under the influence of solar mythology, first nature and ultimately the cosmos are de-souled. Great Mother to the Great Father. As the human psyche draws further and further away from the matrix of nature in the solar era, the predominant image of spirit changes from Great Mother to Great Father. The greater the withdrawal from nature, the more transcendent and disengaged from nature becomes the image of deity. In the myth of the goddess, we summed up this primary change of consciousness. If the relation to nature as the mother is one of identity, and the relation to nature from father is one of disassociation, then the movement from mother to father symbolizes an ever-increasing separation from a state of containment in nature, experienced no longer as nurturing to life, but as stifling to growth. The story of the ferocious struggle between the supporters of the two mythologies is told in the Old Testament, which repeatedly documents the destruction of the shrines and groves of the goddess. But ye shall destroy their altars, break their images, and cut down their groves, for thou shalt worship no other god, for the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God. Exodus chapter 34, verse 13. This was the earliest known example of iconoclasm, or the destruction of images. All the images of and references to the hated Canaanite mother goddess Asherah were eradicated, so that there would be no challenge to the supremacy of Yahweh. Her statue and that of the great bronze serpent that accompanied her cult were repeatedly thrown out of the temple in Jerusalem. Divine immanence, once associated with the image of the Great Mother and the great goddesses of the Bronze Age, was gradually and irrevocably lost. Collective belief replaces shamanic experience of the invisible dimension of the otherworld and the profound sense of relationship with sacred features of the natural world, which gave access to that mysterious dimension. The changeover from lunar to solar mythology and culture takes thousands of years, moving through a phase where goddesses and gods preside over a world that was still filled with the spirits inhabiting every grove and spring, river and mountain. With the arrival of Judaism, Christianity and Islam, with their transcendent monotheistic God image, all these were eventually banished and pagan rituals outlawed. Judaic monotheism eradicated polytheism, and with it the connection to the spirits of the land and the great cycles of nature. The land of Palestine became the gift of Yahweh to the Jewish people, originating with his promise to Abraham, and sowing the seeds of conflict and oppression that would rage in our time 3,000 years later. The image of spirit which governed the patriarchal cultures was overwhelmingly male, perhaps, as Freud suggested, the unconscious projection of the patriarchal father. Whatever the political and social reasons for the emergence of this powerful male image of deity, creation was now believed to arise from the word of the Father, no longer from the womb of the mother. The Creator was beyond creation, no longer immanent within it. This is crucially important because it reflects the fact that the oneness of life is broken. Nature is disassociated from the spirit. With this shift of archetypal imagery, everything formerly associated with the Great Mother and the feminine is downgraded in relation to the masculine. The subjugation of women. The polarizing emphasis of solar mythology created a widening fissure between man and woman that led to her oppression and persecution. Gradually, over the next 3 millennia, the priesthoods, who held the reins of theological power, came to identify the male aspect of life with spirit, light, order, and the rational mind, which were named as good, and to identify the female aspect of life with nature, darkness, chaos, and body, which were frequently identified with evil. This fundamental polarization was absorbed into religious teaching and integrated with tribal customs and beliefs that gave man the dominant position over woman. Woman and her body began to be seen as a danger, a threat, a sexual temptation for man. Nature, woman, and the body became closely identified with each other. For this reason, all had to be subject to the will of man. Woman, identified with nature, was named as a secondary or inferior creation in the book of Genesis and in the writings of the Greek philosophers. a belief whose effects will be explored in chapters 7 and 8. The patriarchal religions of the solar era carry this polarized way of thinking within their teaching, wherever this is associated with the ascetic subjugation of the body, the mistrust of sexuality, and the fear of woman. The unconscious identification of woman with nature was the origin of the negative projections onto her that were incorporated into the social attitudes and customs fused with religious beliefs that endure to this day. Where does the Taliban's attitude to woman originate, if not in this directive from the earliest Mesopotamian codification of law, circa 2350 BC? If a woman shall speak out against her man, her mouth shall be crushed with a hot brick. Further to the east, in China, the old Taoist vision of an ensouled nature also began to withdraw, replaced by the emphasis on the minutiae of social custom, which relegated women to an inferior and almost slave-like position. The sages of India, with certain exceptions, turned away from the body and sensory experience and held the phenomenal world to be an illusion, placing the emphasis of their teaching on the experience of enlightenment and release from the wheel of rebirth. Here again, woman was an impediment to and a distraction from the spiritual life. The famous story of the Buddha leaving his wife and young son and even his beloved horse reflects the influence of his new solar ideology, where the emphasis was placed on spirit in opposition to the world, woman, and the body. The long-term effects of solar mythology. In Western civilization, solar mythology drove the Promethean quest for freedom, justice, and knowledge, as well as the desire to explore and conquer new territories. As a cultural impulse, it carried with it the human longing, the human quest to go beyond all constraints and limitations. As a cultural impulse, it carried with it the human longing, the human quest to go beyond all constraints and limitations. The word discovery characterizes this whole era. In the sphere of religion, a major theme of solar mythology was, as with Plato, escape from the bondage of the body and, by association, release from the bondage of mortality. In the East, it was release from the wheel of rebirth. It is a linear and essentially utopian and transcendent mythology, rather than one that relates us to the earth. Its primary theme was, and still is, empowerment, ascent, progress, achievement, conquest, carried through to our own day in Bronowski's famous television documentary series in the mid-60s, The Ascent of Man, which aimed to show the whole spectrum of discoveries and inventions that revealed man's ability to control nature, not to be controlled by it. Solar mythology has empowered the gifted or heroic individual to differentiate himself from the tribal group, bestowing immense benefits on humanity and leading to extraordinary culture-transforming discoveries. It has, through the struggle for justice and freedom, led ultimately to the establishment of democracy in many countries, but it has also encouraged the belief that humanity itself is the solar hero, standing above all other species and having the right to exploit the resources of the earth for its own exclusive benefit, leaving other species defenseless against the onslaught of its perceived rights and needs. This belief was enshrined in the book of Genesis, where, in Genesis chapter 1, verse 28, Adam and Eve are granted dominion over the earth. And God blessed them, and said to them, Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth. In another fateful passage, Noah and his sons are told to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth, and upon every bird of the air, upon everything that creeps upon the ground, and all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they are delivered. Genesis chapter 9, verses 1 to 2. Today we face the legacy of these two hugely influential passages. Solar mythology drives all utopian ideologies and the dream of scientific and technological progress. It is overwhelmingly male because the male psyche has been the dominant influence in the world during the solar era, and it is the achievements, discoveries, and courageous actions of exceptional men which have inspired and offered a role model to other men, a strong sense of individuality and a focused ego, which ultimately came to be identified with the conscious, rational mind, can be acknowledged as the supreme achievement of the male psyche during the solar era. But the voice of women, who, in the rising patriarchal societies, were denied access to education, the priesthood, and the healing profession, was silenced. The ongoing quest for power and omnipotence. In Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, the influence of solar mythology fueled a zeal to conquer and subdue territory for Yahweh, Christ, or Allah, with catastrophic consequences for the peoples who were conquered by the sword. Ultimately, it fueled the desire of the West to create new empires and led to the creation of the British Empire, which in 1900 ruled 1/4 of the world, both in territory and population. It also fueled the ideologies which caused unspeakable suffering and millions of deaths. It also fueled the ideologies which caused unspeakable suffering and millions of deaths in the 20th century. The celebration of conquest and supremacy begins in the 3rd millennium BC in Mesopotamia and Egypt, with the conquests of Sargon of Akkad and the Egyptian pharaohs, and continues with Hiroshima, Vietnam, Iraq, and the horrific nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons of modern warfare. War breeds fear, and fear breeds war, activating and strengthening the predator-prey pattern in the older brain system, chapters 12 and 13. If continued for long enough, it becomes a habit that is almost impossible to resist. The long chronicle of conquest and human sacrifice, of exaltation in power and the subjugation of enemies, might truly be named the dark shadow of the solar age. In the impersonal accounts of these catastrophes, whose effects we have to imagine, since they were not reported, so many dead, so many wounded, homeless, widowed, or orphaned, there is never recorded the unquantifiable laceration of the human heart. As in the past, so still today, the lifeless bodies of men, women, and children, transfixed in the agony of their death, lie abandoned on the streets of ravished cities and villages, and the desecrated soil of earth. Each was once the child of parents who carefully tended that life from infancy, who cherished hopes and dreams for their child who was precious to them. How casually these lives were and are destroyed wherever young men are summoned by their leaders to serve their nation or their religion by killing each other. The life of the world passes on. New generations are born. Only a few remember. Only a few have the will and determination to change this pattern of ritual sacrifice. Only a few feel remorse for the lives they extinguished by obeying orders while acting in defense of their country, their tribal group, or their religion. The rest bury their guilt. What happens to the souls of the dead, cut off in the prime of life? I feel the weight of their silent anguish through the centuries, the weight of the souls of men, women, and children severed from the world by human cruelty, human depravity. In this world, the tears of the dead and the grief of those who mourn them are lost. In this world, the tears of the dead and the grief of those who mourn them are soon lost in the thundering surf of life. Until I became a mother myself, I did not think of the generations of anonymous mothers I did not think of the generations of anonymous mothers who tended life in their children, cherish in its beauty. Until I became a mother myself, I did not think of the generations of anonymous mothers who tended life in their children, cherishing it in its beauty, brevity, and fragility, hoping that they would survive and flourish and live to have children of their own. Now, through my own experience as mother and grandmother, I have become capable of imagining the silent fear and anguish of women, the tracking and killing of human prey by human predators, the terror of people hunted down, killed, and forgotten through countless generations. There is no monument to the holocausts of victims sacrificed in past ages. There is no record of the women raped by marauding armies who cherished and nurtured their children month by month, day by day, year by year, only to see their lives crushed by the pitiless boot of war. Wherever today we still find the tendency to omnipotence and grandiose ambitions of empire and world domination, we can discern the influence of solar mythology and the inflation or hubris of leaders who unconsciously identify themselves with the mythic role of the solar god or hero engaging in the battle to defeat the dragon of darkness and evil. Solar mythology and the split between mind and soul. With the psychological insight which has become available to us over the last 100 years, particularly through the depth psychology of Jung, we can understand that this solar phase of our evolution reflects a radical dissociation within our psyche between the growing strength of the ego, the hero, and the older and greatly feared power of instinct, the dragon, that was identified with nature and the irrational animal passions of man. As this dual dissociation gathered momentum, so the feeling of containment within a greater cosmic entity and the sense of relationship with nature and with an unseen dimension of reality faded, and with it the participatory consciousness of the lunar era. During the solar era, consciousness strives to ascend upwards towards the light, fearing and repudiating the darkness because of the fear of regressing into the unconscious state of nature. Power becomes exalted as the sole means of ensuring survival. The legacy of the Platonic emphasis on reason and the rational mind, together with the impact of literacy and the solar emphasis on the ascent to spirit, accompanied by a deep suspicion of woman and sexuality, hastens the demise of the lunar way of knowing and the former instinctive sense of living within a sacred order. The supreme achievement of the solar era was the emergence of a strong, autonomous sense of individuality, conscious ego, from the matrix of instinct, and the development of the reflective, rational mind in all who had access to education. But this had a high price. First, the inflation or hubris of the ego as it drew away from its instinctive ground and began to assimilate a godlike power to itself. Secondly, the subjugation and repression of the instinctual, the non-rational, and the feminine, which, identified with each other, were perceived as threatening to the hegemony of the masculine ego. Keith Sagar, in his brilliant book, Literature and the Crime Against Nature, chronicles the devastating critique of Western civilization offered by its greatest poets and writers, beginning with Homer and the Greek tragedians and ending with Ted Hughes, and comments, "The history of Western civilization has been the history of man's increasingly devastating crimes against nature. Nature defined not only as the earth and its life forms, powers and processes, but also as the female in all its manifestations, and as the natural man within the individual psyche. It is the story of man's mutilation of nature, in his attempt to make it conform to the Procrustean bed of his own patriarchal, anthropocentric, and rectilinear thinking. The danger of utopian ideologies, negative projections. Solar myth continues to cast its spell today. It is carried in all utopian ideologies which strive to impose the light of a new world order and split off the darkness or anything that opposes it. Its characteristic is grandiosity. It entered not only into the sacred texts of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, but, most significantly, into our behavior towards the dark and so-called primitive, more instinctual, indigenous peoples, who fell victim to the race for empire of the European nations. The catalogue of horror inflicted during the course of the conquest and attempt to convert these primitive peoples, whether in South and Central America, in Africa, India, or further east, has been minutely documented and still continues in places like the Amazonian and Indonesian rainforests, where the commercial interests of giant Western corporations are destroying these forests, ignoring and overriding the protests of the forest peoples. A recent example of this attitude is the deportation in 1971 of the 1,800 people of the Chagos Islands in an arrangement between the United Kingdom and the United States to lease the island of Diego Garcia to the latter for use as a military base for the launching of long-distance missiles. By this disgraceful contract, the entire island's chain was described as fully sanitized and cleansed of life, including the dogs who were gassed. These people have still not been allowed to return to their home, which has, in 2011, been declared a marine sanctuary. As time went on, religions, particularly Christianity and Islam, took on the mantle of solar mythology in a militant struggle for supremacy. The deadly animosity between Catholic and Protestant in European history, between Shia and Sunni in the Islamic world, and between Israelis and Palestinians, may be traced to the polarizing influence of this mythology and, more importantly, to the split in the psyche that underlies it. As long as we are not conscious of the fissure within our own nature and our catastrophic disconnection from our instinctual soul, we will be driven to seek out and attack an object on which to project our darkness. This unconscious mechanism of projection still operates in the religio-political sphere, as is illustrated by the ongoing tension between the Christian cultures of the West and the Islamic cultures of the Middle East. We can find the tendency of solar mythology to encourage negative projections onto others, reflected in the secular totalitarian ideologies which ravaged the last century, when they separated the heroic race or chosen people from those whom they demonized as inferior or expendable. We can see its polarizing influence at work in the Holocaust, where Hitler and his ideology of National Socialism exterminated millions of Jews and others who were perceived as racially, genetically, or mentally inferior. The same polarizing influence can be found in the communist regime of the former Soviet Union, in Maoist China, where 45 million people perished, in Cambodia under Pol Pot, in Bosnia under Milosevic, and now, 2012, in Syria under the Assad regime. These regimes justified the elimination of racial, class, tribal, or ethnic enemies, just as Christianity and Islam had justified the elimination of heretics and apostates. All were and are able to recruit people who believed they were doing good by obeying orders and slaughtering their fellow men and women. The International Criminal Court in The Hague is challenging this belief by trying those who obeyed orders for crimes against humanity. The survival of the sense of an ensouled cosmos. Although the focus of later Christian culture was directed away from the earth and towards heaven, away from matter and towards spirit, the sense of living within an ensouled cosmos survived until the end of the Middle Ages in Europe. The poets and artists, as well as the mystics and visionaries of the Christian West, kept alive the shamanic experience of earlier times. St. Francis, 1181 to 1226, on the night before he wrote his famous Canticle of the Sun, had a vision of the earth as a glowing golden orb. In this canticle, as in the contemporary philosophy of the Middle Ages, there is the recognition that the foremost luminaries, the moon and the sun, and the great hierarchy of the angelic and archangelic orders, as well as the animals and the birds, all belong to a sacred or divine cosmic order. This was the time which saw the great pilgrimages in Europe to the sacred sites of the Black Madonna, often places where the goddess Isis had been worshipped in Roman times, and the building of the soaring glory of the Gothic cathedrals, dedicated to the Virgin Mary, and designed to embody the Pythagorean concept of the perfect mathematical harmony of a divinely ordered cosmos that was reflected in this world. It also saw the dissemination of the Grail legends over a wide area of Europe, the sacred place of connection between the human and the divine was the cathedral or shrine. After the terrible decades of the Black Death in the 14th century, the idea of an ensouled world found new expression in 15th century Florence, when Cosimo de' Medici founded his Platonic Academy and commissioned Marsilio Ficino to translate Plato, Plotinus, and the texts of the Egyptian Hermetic tradition. Through this channel, the Platonic concept of a world soul and his triad of truth, beauty, goodness were reborn in Italy, giving rise to the glory of the Renaissance. Venus, the goddess of love and beauty, was restored in Botticelli's Primavera and his Birth of Venus. The body began to be rehabilitated as the sculptors and painters of that time reconnected with a pre-Christian pagan past. Pico della Mirandola gave his brilliant Oration on the Dignity of Man in 1486. The philosopher and cultural historian Richard Tarnas vividly describes Pico's vision and this new era in his Passion of the Western Mind. With the influx of this tradition came a new vision of man, nature, and the divine. Neoplatonism, based on Plotinus's conception of the world as an emanation from the transcendent one, portrayed nature as permeated by divinity, a noble expression of the world soul. Stars and planets, light, plants, even stones possessed a numinous dimension, the ancient Pythagorean vision of a universe ordered according to transcendent mathematical forms received an intense renewal of interest and promised to reveal nature as permeated by a mystical intelligence whose language was number and geometry. The garden of the world was again enchanted with magical powers and transcendent meanings implicit in every part of nature. But this wonderful new impulse, which came close to restoring the old lunar consciousness at a new level, faded with the onset of the grim realities of the Protestant Reformation. We can follow the polarizing influence of solar mythology through subsequent centuries, when the new religion of Protestantism sought to eradicate as much as it could of the evidence of the Catholic religion, and turned against its sacred images with savage fury, leaving thousands of churches unadored. In England, more than 95% of the artistic heritage of the Middle Ages was destroyed in the 16th and 17th centuries, beginning with the destruction of the monasteries under Henry VIII, when wall paintings were obliterated by whitewash, and literally thousands of superb sculptures and wooden images of Christ, the Virgin, and the saints were defaced, burnt, and smashed to pieces by men who took pride in their acts of vandalism that would wipe out all vestiges of superstition. England never recovered from this rape of her soul and the loss of her supremely gifted artists. It was at this time that the English people were prohibited from worshipping the Virgin as they had done for centuries. Churches were instructed to sing no more praises to Our Lady, only to our Lord. The vision of a sacred earth and cosmos slowly faded, accelerated by the growing fascination with science, the coming of the Industrial Revolution, and the new emphasis on the power of man to control nature and shape his destiny. What was increasingly lost was the visionary imagination so respected by Coleridge, and the sense of an ensouled nature that was reanimated by the Romantic poets in the late 18th century, and reflected in the poetry of Wordsworth and the words of the poet and artist William Blake. Everything that lives is holy. The return of the soul.
Yet now, mysteriously and fortuitously, beneath the surface of our culture, the ancient concept of the soul and the unity of life is returning. The challenge of the immense problems facing us is urging us to reflect on our current understanding of reality and modify the oppositional paradigm we have inherited from the powerful influence of solar mythology. A deep human instinct is attempting to restore balance and wholeness in us by rediscovering values rooted in an older way of knowing. One example of this is the environmental movement, which is restoring respect for the earth. In his introduction to Frederick Turner's book, Beyond Geography, The Western Spirit Against the Wilderness, T.H. Watkins observes that if the environmental movement succeeds in redeeming at least some of the damage our history has done, future generations may view it as the most important social movement of all time. If we are to understand the present, we need to know about the past, the foundation from which our present beliefs and attitudes have developed. Through the discoveries made in the last 100 or so years, we know that we are living now at the end of a long trajectory of several million years, which has brought about the gradual separation or differentiation of our human species from the animal kingdom, together with the development of self-awareness and the sense of self that we call individuality, a highly developed intellect, a fertile imagination, and the power to apply both intellect and imagination to formulate goals and to achieve them, everything that we now call human consciousness. Despite its phenomenal cultural and technological achievements, the whole edifice of the solar age rests on the foundation of our separation from nature, and within the psyche, the split between our conscious rational mind and our instinctual soul, which led us to lose the sense of participation in a sacred and living cosmos. Whether this split was a necessary part of the evolution of consciousness is open to debate, but it has happened, and only now are we brought face to face with its legacy, with perhaps sufficient consciousness to heal it. Richard Tarnas has described the story of the evolution of consciousness as both an heroic ascent to autonomy and a tragic fall from unity. He views the history of the last 2,500 years as a series of births which have forged Western consciousness and Western civilization. But now, he believes, we are entering a new phase in our evolution, one that will reconnect or reunite those elements of our nature which have been fragmented and lost, and those elements of life we have seen as separate from ourselves. In the epilogue to The Passion of the Western Mind, he writes,
We stand at the threshold of a revelation of the nature of reality that could shatter our most established beliefs about ourselves and the world, The very constriction we are experiencing is part of the dynamic of our imminent release. For the deepest passion of the Western mind has been to reunite with the ground of its being. The driving impulse of the West's masculine consciousness has been its quest not only to realize itself, to forge its own autonomy, but also, finally, to recover its connection with the whole, to come to terms with the great feminine principle in life, to differentiate itself from, but then rediscover and reunite with the feminine, with the mystery of life, of nature, of soul. And that reunion can now occur on a new and profoundly different level from that of the primordial unconscious unity, for the long evolution of human consciousness has prepared it to be capable at last of embracing the ground and matrix of its own being, freely and consciously. As this deep soul impulse gathers momentum, the marriage of the re-emerging lunar consciousness with the dominant solar one is beginning to change our perception of reality. This gives us hope for the future. If we can recover the values intrinsic to the ancient participatory way of knowing, without losing the priceless evolutionary attainment of a strong and focused ego, together with all the discoveries we have made and the skills we have developed, we could heal both the fissure in our soul and our raped and vandalized planet.
As this deep soul impulse gathers momentum, the marriage of the re-emerging lunar consciousness with the dominant solar one is beginning to change our perception of reality. This gives us hope for the future. If we can recover the values intrinsic to the ancient participatory way of knowing, without losing the priceless evolutionary attainment of a strong and focused ego, together with all the discoveries we have made and the skills we have developed, we could heal both the fissure in our soul and our raped and vandalized planet.